When my late wife, as children, stood in a lawyer's office and accused me of being a predator who had manipulated their mother for her fortune, I did not shout or defend myself. I simply listened, my hands resting calmly on my cane, because I knew this was the moment Beatrice had been preparing for. Her final act of love was not just the inheritance she left me, but the perfectly designed legal trap she had laid within her will. They thought they were initiating a lawsuit, but they had just eagerly triggered their own disinheritance. Before I explain how my wife's brilliant planning came to fruition, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think of no contest clauses in a will. My name is Julian Croft, and at 79 years old, my life in Boston, Massachusetts is a quiet one. For 45 years, I worked as a rare book appraiser, a profession that suited my meticulous and patient nature. My days were spent in the hushed quiet of archives and private libraries, examining the delicate architecture of a book's binding and the faded ink of a long-dead author. My life was orderly and solitary until I met Beatrice when I was 64. She was a vibrant widow, a retired art history professor who walked into my shop one day with a rare first edition of a poetry collection. We spent 2 hours talking about books and art and discovered we spoke the same language of quiet passion. Marrying her was the single greatest decision of my life. Our 15 years together were a gift, a luminous final chapter for both of us. We shared a love for history, for walks along the Charles River in the autumn, and for the comfortable silence of two people reading in the same room. I loved her deeply, and she loved me. Her children, Richard and Caroline, never quite saw it that way. They were in their late 40s, successful in their own right, but they carried an air of perpetual, grasping entitlement. They had always seen their mother's brownstone and her impressive art collection not as parts of her life, but as the components of their future inheritance. From the beginning, they treated me with a polite but clear dismissiveness. To them, I was not their mother's husband. I was a temporary caretaker, a companion she had acquired in her old age. Their visits were always punctuated with assessments of value. "That painting would fetch a pretty penny at auction, Mom," Richard would say, eyeing a piece over the mantel. Caroline would compliment the antique furniture, then casually ask if it had been recently appraised. They spoke of my wife's possessions as if she were already gone, a ghost in her own home. Beatrice was not blind to their nature. She loved them, but she was not a fool. One evening, as we sat in her study, she looked up from her book and said, "They have good hearts, my children, but they have a blind spot when it comes to money. It is a flaw in their character, like a weak joint in a binding." She had patted my hand. "Do not worry, Julian. I have made arrangements. Everything will be taken care of, and my will shall be my final word on the matter. It will be clear, concise, and legally unassailable. I did not ask for details. That was her domain. My domain was ensuring her final years were filled with peace and love, not arguments over her estate. When she passed away after a short illness, the grief was a vast, silent weight. Richard and Caroline were there, of course, making the funeral arrangements with an efficiency that felt more like a corporate merger than a final farewell. In the days between her death and the reading of the will, their true colors began to show. Caroline walked through the house with a small notebook, making an inventory of the art. Richard asked me, with no subtlety whatsoever, when I planned on downsizing to a more manageable apartment. They were not grieving their mother. They were liquidating her. They had already written me out of her life. They assumed her will would do the same. They had no idea that Beatrice, the brilliant and clear-eyed woman they had consistently underestimated, had already written them out of her final act. The reading of the will was scheduled for a week after the funeral. We gathered in the downtown Boston office of Alistair Finch, Beatrice's longtime estate lawyer. The conference room was a somber space of dark wood and leather-bound books, a room that smelled of old paper and money. Richard and Caroline were already there when I arrived. They sat on one side of the polished table, a united front of simmering resentment. They were dressed in expensive, dark suits, looking less like grieving children and more like a hostile corporate acquisition team. They acknowledged my presence with a pair of curt, identical nods, then immediately turned back to their hushed conversation, making it clear I was an outsider in this final family affair. I took a seat opposite them, the wide expanse of the table, a physical representation of the chasm between us. The tension in the room was thick and palpable. They were coiled springs of anticipation, confident that their mother's final wishes would align with their lifelong expectations. They saw the will as a formality, the final step in transferring ownership of what they already considered theirs. Mr. Finch entered the room carrying a single heavy document. He was a man in his late 60s, with a stoic demeanor and eyes that had seen the best and worst of human nature, usually during probate. He had been Beatrice the lawyer for over 30 years and was a man I knew she trusted completely. He offered his condolences to us all, then sat at the head of the table. "As you know," he began, his voice dry and formal, "we are here to execute the last will and testament of Beatrice Croft. This document was prepared and signed 5 years ago, and it was reviewed and reaffirmed by Beatrice 1 year ago. She was, on both occasions, in full possession of her faculties and found to be of sound mind by independent medical evaluation. He was already building a fortress of legal fact, a detail I am certain Beatrice had insisted upon. He began to read. The initial passages were standard legal language, assigning Mr. Finch as the executor and directing the payment of all final expenses. Richard and Caroline listened impatiently, their expressions bored. Then Mr. Finch paused and cleared his throat. "We now come to the primary bequests." Beatrice asked that I read this first section verbatim. He adjusted his glasses and read, "To my beloved husband, Julian Croft, I give my unending love and gratitude. These past 15 years have been the happiest of my life, a period of profound peace and shared joy. He has been my partner, my confidant, and my truest friend. His love was a gift that illuminated my final years, and I leave this world with no regrets." I felt a lump form in my throat. It was Beatrice's voice, her words reaching out to me one last time. Across the table, Richard and Caroline exchanged an irritated look. This was not the perfunctory mention of a late-in-life companion they had expected. It was a declaration of love, and they hated it. Mr. Finch continued, "To my husband, Julian Croft, I bequeath, for the duration of his natural life, our home at 94 Beacon Street, Boston, Massachusetts, along with all of its contents, including all art, antiques, books, and personal effects." The room went utterly still. Caroline let out a small, sharp gasp, as if she had been struck. Richard's face, which had been a mask of smug patience, contorted into a look of pure, uncomprehending rage. "What?" he blurted out, unable to contain himself. "All of it?" Mr. Finch ignored him and kept reading. "Furthermore, I bequeath to my husband, Julian Croft, the entirety of my investment portfolio, held at Morgan Stanley, to provide for his comfort and well-being for the remainder of his life." That was it. The dam of their composure broke completely. "This is a joke," Caroline said, her voice a high, tight wire of disbelief. "He manipulated her. He must have. She was a vulnerable old woman. This is elder abuse. She was not in her right mind when she signed this," Richard added, his voice rising. "We will fight this. We will contest this in court. There is no way our mother, in her right mind, would have cut her own children out in favor of a man she knew for a fraction of her life." The accusations filled the air, ugly and venomous. They looked at me with open hatred, their dismissiveness replaced by raw, undisguised fury. Mr. Finch held up a hand. "I must remind you," he said, his voice calm but firm, that Beatrice had a full psychiatric evaluation at the time of the signing. She was found to be exceptionally sharp. The will is legally ironclad. He then read their bequests. Beatrice had left them each a trust fund of $100,000 to be used exclusively for the education of their own children, her grandchildren. It was a final, pointed act of a grandmother, not the multi-million-dollar windfall the children had been expecting. Richard stood up so abruptly, his chair screeched against the floor. "This is not over," he seethed, pointing a finger first at Mr. Finch, then at me. "We will see you in court." They stormed out of the office, leaving a wake of furious silence. I sat there, not with a sense of victory, but with a profound sadness. Beatrice had seen this coming. She had known their hearts so well, and she had made her arrangements. They thought they had just declared war, but they had no idea the war was already over, and they had just ensured their own unconditional surrender. The immediate aftermath of the will reading was a barrage of legal aggression. Richard and Caroline, true to their word, moved with incredible speed. Within a week, I received a thick, intimidating packet of documents from their legal team. They had filed a petition to formally contest the will in probate court. The papers were a work of fiction, a carefully crafted narrative designed to paint me as a villainous opportunist and their mother as a doddering, simple-minded victim. The betrayal was no longer just in their greedy assumptions. It was now in black and white, a public record of their lies. The lawsuit alleged that I had exerted undue influence over Beatrice, that I had isolated her from her family, and that I had coerced her into changing her will for my own financial gain. They claimed her cognitive state had been in decline for years, a fact they had privately worried about, but had been too respectful to address. It was a disgusting and cowardly perversion of the truth. Our life together, a life of quiet companionship and mutual respect, was twisted into a sinister plot. My love for Beatrice was reframed as a long con, a performance I had maintained for 15 years to secure a multi-million-dollar inheritance. The emotional consequence was profound. I was a 79-year-old man, still deep in the raw grief of losing my wife, and I was being forced to defend our love against the very children she had brought into the world. Every morning, I woke up in the house we had shared, surrounded by the art and books she had cherished. And the day was immediately poisoned by the knowledge that her children were trying to tear it all away, not just from me, but from her memory. Their campaign was not limited to the courtroom. They began a campaign of social assassination. They spoke to old family friends, neighbors, anyone who would listen, spreading their poisonous narrative. I heard through the grapevine that Carolyn was telling people her mother had become, confused and easily led in her final years. Richard was suggesting that I had rushed into the marriage and had always been secretive about my own finances. They were trying to erase the last 15 years of their mother's life, to invalidate the happiness she had found with me, because it was an inconvenient truth that stood in the way of their money. The true depth of their betrayal, however, was in how they treated me personally. They tried to have me removed from the house, claiming I was a risk to the assets of the estate. Their lawyers sent letters demanding an immediate inventory of all valuables, implying I was a common thief who might start selling off the silverware. They were not just contesting a will, they were attempting to humiliate and dispossess me, to render me homeless and penniless while the courts sorted out their fabricated claims. My lawyer, Alistair Finch, was a rock of calm in this storm. We sat in his office, the threatening legal documents spread across his desk. "This is a standard tactic, Julian," he explained, his voice calm and reassuring. "It is ugly, it is personal, and it is designed to intimidate you into a settlement. They are hoping you will be so worn down by the process that you will agree to give them a large chunk of the estate just to make them go away." I looked at the papers, at the vile accusations, and felt a quiet, firm resolve solidify within me. Beatrice had known this would happen. She had anticipated their greed, their cruelty, their willingness to defame her memory to get what they wanted. She knew, I said to Mr. Finch. She told me she had made arrangements. She said her will would be her final word. Mr. Finch nodded, a thin, knowing smile touching his lips for the first time. She did indeed, he said. Beatrice was a brilliant woman. She and I spent a great deal of time constructing this will. It is more than a document, Julian. It is a fortress. And her children have just walked up to the main gate and started banging on it with their fists. He then explained the final brilliant piece of her strategy, the part he had not read aloud at the initial meeting. Your wife, he said, tapping a specific clause in the will, included what is known as an in terrorem, or no contest clause. It is a provision that states if any beneficiary directly contests the validity of the will, that beneficiary's share of the estate is immediately forfeited. I stared at him, understanding dawning. Their inheritance, I whispered. The trust funds for the grandchildren. Precisely, Mr. Finch confirmed. By filing this lawsuit, Richard and Caroline have legally triggered their own disinheritance under the terms of the will. The moment they filed this petition, they forfeited the $200,000 Beatrice left for her grandchildren. They have, in a very real sense, stolen from their own children in their greedy attempt to steal from you. The beauty of it was devastating. Beatrice had not been vindictive. She had given them a choice. They could accept her final wishes with grace and provide for their children, or they could reveal their true character and lose everything. They had, of course, chosen the latter. They had walked right into the trap she had set, blinded by their own avarice. The time for passive defense was over. It was time to let Beatrice's final word be heard. The probate court hearing was scheduled for a cold, gray morning in December. The weight of the impending confrontation was heavy, but my grief had now been joined by a steely sense of purpose. I was not just defending myself. I was executing Beatrice's final brilliant maneuver. I made a conscious decision that morning. I would not enter the courtroom as a defendant. I would enter as Beatrice's husband, the steward of her final wishes. I chose to wear the tweed jacket she had always loved, the one she said made me look like a distinguished professor. It was a small, silent act of defiance, a way of bringing her presence into the room with me. My first step in this new, offensive phase was to trust Alistair Finch completely. He was a master of the quiet, procedural warfare of probate law. Our plan was not to engage in a messy, emotional battle over their accusations. That was their territory. Our plan was to let the will itself do the fighting. We would not argue about Beatrice's mental state or my character. We would simply present the legal reality of their actions. They want to turn this into a soap opera, Julian, Alistair had told me in his office. We are going to keep it a legal proceeding. We will let their greed be the only character on trial. In the week leading up to the hearing, we began to test their resolve and expose their contradictions. Alistair's legal team filed a motion requesting all of Richard and Caroline's correspondence with their mother for the past 5 years, including emails, text messages, and letters. We knew that this would create a panic. Their narrative was that their mother was a confused, isolated woman. But their own communications would likely prove otherwise, showing a vibrant, engaged woman who managed her own affairs. The motion was a strategic probe. We wanted to see how they would react when asked to produce evidence that would contradict their own claims. The response from their lawyers was immediate and frantic. They filed a counter-motion to quash our request, claiming it was an unnecessary and burdensome fishing expedition. It was a telling move. They were unwilling to provide the very evidence that should have supported their case. They knew their own words would condemn them. The second part of our plan was to highlight their blatant hypocrisy. We subpoenaed the financial records for the consulting firm Richard owned. We were not looking for anything specific, but the act of demanding the records was a shot across the bow. He had accused me of financial manipulation, while likely running his own life with the detached precision of a corporate raider. We were testing their own vulnerability to the kind of scrutiny they were trying to place on me. The most critical part of the plan, however, was to do nothing at all to negotiate. Richard and Caroline, through their lawyers, sent a settlement offer. It was an insulting proposal, offering me a small, one-time payout and the right to remain in the house for 1 year, after which the property and all its contents would be turned over to them. They expected me, the tired old man they had painted me as, to jump at the chance to avoid a painful court battle. They saw it as a generous offer. "We will not be responding," Alistair told their lawyer over the phone, a conversation he later recounted to me. "We will see your clients in court." This refusal to engage was our most powerful weapon. It communicated a level of confidence that clearly unnerved them. They were bullies, used to people folding under pressure. My complete silence, my refusal to even acknowledge their offer, was a move they did not understand. It did not fit their narrative of the frightened old man. They had expected me to be scared, to be desperate. Instead, I was a silent, immovable object, protected by the fortress Beatrice had built. They had no idea that their lawsuit, their settlement offer, and their furious legal maneuvering were all completely irrelevant. They were fighting a battle that had already been lost, a war that had been decided the moment Beatrice put her pen to paper 5 years earlier. On the morning of the hearing, as I sat beside Alistair in the quiet courtroom, I felt a profound sense of calm. I was not here to fight Richard and Caroline. I was here to witness the final brilliant act of the woman I loved, a woman who had known that the best way to defeat her greedy children was to simply let them defeat themselves. Before we go on, please hit the like button. It really is a huge help to the channel. Their lawsuit was a performance for the court, but my wife's will was the final script. The execution of Beatrice's plan unfolded with the quiet, deliberate precision of a master playing a game of chess. The probate courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, an austere, wood-paneled room that felt both formal and intimate. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Marion Hayes, looked over her spectacles at the assembled parties with an expression that suggested she had very little time for family squabbles. Richard and Caroline sat with their lawyer, a slick, aggressive man named Mr. Davenport, looking confident and righteous. I sat beside Alistair Finch, a silent partner in the proceedings to come. Mr. Davenport began the proceedings, his voice filling the room with dramatic, well-rehearsed indignation. He spent nearly 30 minutes painting a vivid picture of my supposed villainy. He described me as a man of no independent means who had, systematically and insidiously, worked my way into the affections of a lonely, vulnerable woman. He spoke of Beatrice as if she were a fragile, simple-minded creature, not the formidable intellect I had known and loved. "We will present evidence," he boomed, gesturing toward his clients, "from her own children, who witnessed her sad and marked decline. We will show that Mr. Croft isolated her, controlled her finances, and ultimately coerced her into signing a will that is a complete betrayal of her lifelong intentions." Richard and Caroline nodded along, their faces masks of solemn grief. It was a masterful performance, and I could see a flicker of sympathy in the judge's eyes. This was exactly what they wanted, to turn the courtroom into a theater for their fabricated drama. When he was finally finished, Judge Hayes turned to my side of the table. "Mr. Finch," she said, her tone weary, "your response?" Alistair Finch did not rise. He remained seated, the picture of calm professionalism. "Your Honor," he began, his voice devoid of any theatricality. We could spend the next several weeks arguing about Mr. Croft's character. We could call witnesses who would testify to the deep and genuine love he and his late wife shared. We could present the sworn affidavits from not one, but 2 independent psychiatrists who evaluated Beatrice at the time of the wills he's signing and found her to be of exceptionally sound mind and under no duress whatsoever. As he spoke, he placed a thick binder on the table. "We have in this binder copies of all of those documents. We also have 5 years of email correspondence between Beatrice and her children, which they have conveniently fought to keep out of this courtroom. Correspondence that paints a picture of a vibrant, intelligent woman who is very much in control of her own life and deeply disappointed in her children as avarice. Richard and Caroline shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the part they had rehearsed. Alistair paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "But we are not going to do that, Your Honor," he continued, "because it is not necessary. The petitioners have made our case for us." He then directed the judge to a specific page and clause in the will, a copy of which was on her desk. Beatrice Croft, who her children have just described as a confused and witless woman, had the foresight to include a standard, but very powerful, in terrorem clause in her will. Article 7, Section 4. He waited as the judge found the passage and read it to herself. Her expression, which had been one of tired patience, slowly changed to one of sharp, focused interest. "The clause, as you can see," Alistair stated, "is quite clear. It stipulates that should any beneficiary make a direct or indirect legal challenge to any provision of this will, their bequest and the bequests of their descendants shall be forfeited and absorbed into the residual of the estate." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Richard and Caroline were staring at their own lawyer, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Mr. Davenport looked as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Your Honor," Alistair concluded, his voice as sharp and clean as a scalpel, "when Mr. and Ms. Sterling filed their petition to contest this will, they officially triggered Article 7, Section 4. By their own legal action, they have forfeited their inheritance. They have not only disinherited themselves, they have disinherited their own children. Their case, therefore, is moot. They no longer have legal standing as beneficiaries to challenge this will. We move for a summary dismissal." The plan had been executed. Beatrice's foresight, her brilliant, quiet understanding of her own children's character, had just been laid bare. She had not needed me to defend our love. She had not needed doctors to defend her mind. She had used her children's own greed, their own litigious, grasping nature, as the very instrument of their defeat. The trap had been in the document all along, and they had just spent a fortune on lawyers to walk right into it. The courtroom felt as if all the air had been sucked out of it. Judge Hayes looked down at the will, then up over her glasses, her gaze fixed not on Alistair, but directly on Richard and Caroline's lawyer. Mr. Davenport, who just moments before had been a confident, theatrical performer, was now pale and stammering. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thin and reedy, "this is an ambush. The clause is ... It is a matter of interpretation. My clients were acting in good faith to protect their mother's true wishes." The judge was unmoved. She tapped a finger on the document in front of her. "Mr. Davenport, the language of this clause is not a matter of interpretation. It is as clear and unambiguous as any I have ever seen. Any legal challenge to any provision of this will. You filed a petition to contest the primary bequests. That is the definition of a legal challenge. Were you not aware of this clause when you filed?" A wave of furious whispered conversation erupted between Richard, Caroline, and their lawyer. Their unified front had shattered, replaced by a circular firing squad of blame. Caroline's face was a mask of disbelief, while Richard's was a thundercloud of pure rage directed at the man he was paying to represent him. It was clear Mr. Davenport had either missed the clause in his haste to file or, more likely, had arrogantly dismissed it as unenforceable, a bluff he thought he could call. He had made a catastrophic, career-defining error. Alistair Finch remained perfectly still, a quiet observer of the chaos he had unleashed. He had presented a single irrefutable fact, and with it he had detonated their entire case. The climax was not a fiery battle of wits. It was the cold, swift collapse of a poorly constructed argument. Judge Hayes took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, the gesture of a woman who had seen it all and was deeply unimpressed. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers and silencing the room. "The petitioner's claim of undue influence is at this point irrelevant. The claim of diminished capacity is irrelevant. The only relevant fact before this court is that the petitioners, as named beneficiaries, have willingly and knowingly violated a clear and legally binding provision of the very will they are contesting." She looked directly at Richard and Caroline, her expression devoid of any sympathy. "In terrorem clauses are valid and enforceable in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You were given a choice by your mother. You could have accepted the provisions she laid out, including the generous educational trusts for your children. Instead, you chose to challenge her final, notarized, and medically verified wishes. That was your right, but choices have consequences." She picked up her gavel. "By triggering the no contest clause, the petitioners, Richard Sterling and Caroline Sterling, have forfeited all claims as beneficiaries of the estate of Beatrice Croft. As they are no longer beneficiaries, they no longer have legal standing to continue this contest. This case is summarily dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking the wood block was like a gunshot in the silent room. It was over. The victory was swift, total, and definitive. Richard slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut, the fight completely drained out of him. Caroline buried her face in her hands, a single sharp sob escaping her. They had not just lost a court case, they had been publicly unmasked. They had been shown to be not grieving children, protecting a vulnerable mother, but greedy, grasping heirs who had been outmaneuvered from the grave by the brilliant woman they had so fatally underestimated. Their attempt to paint me as a predator had failed. Instead, they had painted themselves as fools, and in their furious attempt to secure their inheritance, they had ensured they would receive absolutely nothing. As Alistair and I quietly gathered our papers, Richard looked up at me, his eyes filled with a new and different kind of hatred, the hatred of a man who has been utterly and completely defeated by an opponent he never even saw. I met his gaze, my expression calm and unreadable, and then I turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to the wreckage of their own making. Beatrice's final word had been spoken, and it was absolute. That is how I got my so-sweet revenge. I walked out of that Boston courtroom into the crisp December air, feeling not a surge of triumphant joy, but a deep, quiet, and profound sense of peace. The ugly noise of the lawsuit was over, replaced by the calm finality of Beatrice's brilliant design. She had not sought to punish her children. She had simply created a legal instrument that forced them to reveal their own character. The consequences that followed were the natural result of their own actions, a harvest of the seeds they themselves had sown. The life after the court case was one of restoration. The legal cloud that had hung over my head was gone. The brownstone on Beacon Street was no longer a potential asset in a legal battle. It was once again my home, filled with the warm and loving memories of my 15 years with Beatrice. I spent the following weeks simply existing in the space she had created, surrounded by the art she loved and the books we had read together. The house was no longer a museum of her past, but a sanctuary for my future. Alistair Finch handled the final, quiet steps of the probate process. As per the will's instructions, the forfeited bequests, the $200,000 Beatrice had set aside for her grandchildren's education, were absorbed back into the main estate. It was the cruelest irony of all. In their attempt to gain millions, Richard and Caroline had cost their own children a significant educational advantage. Their greed had not only impoverished themselves, but had also stolen from the next generation. I received a few letters from them in the months that followed, letters that cycled through the predictable stages of rage, blame, and finally, a desperate, transparently false attempt at reconciliation. Richard wrote a furious tirade accusing me of being a devious old man who had conspired with the lawyer to trick them. Caroline sent a tear-stained, letter that spoke of her deep love for her mother and how her grief had clouded her judgment. They both ended their letters with suggestions of a private settlement, a last-ditch effort to get some of the money they now knew was legally and forever beyond their reach. I did not respond to any of them. There was nothing left to say. Our relationship, tenuous as it had been, was irrevocably severed. My revenge was not in their financial ruin, but in my complete and total silence. I simply erased them from my life, just as they had tried to erase me from Beatrice's. With the estate settled, I made a decision. I did not need the entirety of Beatrice's considerable fortune. My needs were simple, and my years were numbered. My purpose was not to live lavishly, but to honor her memory in a way that would have made her proud. I worked with Alistair to establish a charitable foundation in her name, the Beatrice Croft Foundation for the Arts. I endowed it with the bulk of her investment portfolio, millions of dollars that would now serve a greater purpose. The foundation's mission is to provide grants to small museums and public libraries, helping them to acquire and preserve works of art and literature. It was a perfect tribute to the art history professor and the rare book appraiser who had found each other late in life. Last spring, I attended the first official event sponsored by the foundation, a small reception at a local library celebrating their acquisition of a collection of rare manuscripts, a purchase made possible by our first grant. I stood at the back of the room, an anonymous old man, and listened as the library's director spoke passionately about Beatrice's legacy and her commitment to making art and history accessible to everyone. In that moment, I felt my wife's presence more profoundly than I had since she passed. This was her true final word. Her legacy was not the house or the money. It was this, the quiet continuation of her passion, a gift that would enrich the community for generations to come. Richard and Caroline had tried to define her by her monetary value, but they had failed. Her real worth, like that of a rare book, was not in its price, but in the story it told and the wisdom it contained. I still live in the brownstone, a quiet caretaker of our shared memories. My days are peaceful, filled with books and quiet reflection. My revenge was never about defeating her children. It was about protecting her final wishes. In doing so, I had not only secured my own peace, but had transformed their greedy, destructive lawsuit into a force for good, ensuring that the name of Beatrice Croft would be remembered not for an ugly inheritance battle, but for a legacy of generosity, beauty, and enduring love. Please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling me what part of the story you liked most.